Hello and welcome to the LIXNAW 1752 podcast. I'm here with Shane Connolly.
Hello.
And Dick Walsh.
Hello.
And I'm James Moore. And in this episode, we're talking to Rosemary Raughter, who's a women's historian. Is that the term? Is that even a term?
I think she does, yeah. I don't know if that's exactly what she calls herself, but she concentrates on women's lives in the 18th century.
Yeah.
So.
And we're talking about Arabella Denny, Nee Fitzmaurice.
Nee Fitzmaurice, yeah.
And I think one thing I didn't establish all that well at the start of this is what her lineage was, how exactly she's situated in society at the time. So, Dick, maybe between the two of us, we'll explain who she was. So, she was one of the Fitzmaurices, isn't that right?
That's correct, yeah.
So, who were the Fitzmaurices and who was she to them?
Well, the Fitzmaurices are central to the project that we're doing. They're the big family who own 90,000 acres in Kerry, and they were historically the barons of Kerry, and then recently her father had became promoted to Earl of Kerry. He became an Earl. They're like an important gentry family in this area.
So her father was Thomas Fitzmaurice, the first Earl of Kerry.
That's right, yeah.
And they were based in LIXNAW.
They're based in LIXNAW, yeah.
And on her mother's side, the Dennys were a big family. Not the Dennys.
Not the Dennys, the Pettys.
Yeah,
they're much more interesting. Well, pretty interesting on her mother's side. So her mother was Anne Petty. She married Thomas Fitzmaurice. Anne Petty was a very intelligent woman. She was good friends with Jonathan Swift of Gulliver's Travels, and she came then from her father was William Petty. So Arabella's grandfather was William Petty, and he did a down survey. He was an economist and philosopher, and he was a very close associate of Oliver Cromwell. And after Oliver Cromwell came over, he surveyed the entire country in record time. Like, it was a huge feat at the time. Like, in a couple of years, he mapped the entire country and precisely decided who owned what. And in the meantime, actually, he discovered 200,000 acres of unclaimed land that nobody owned, and he claimed that for himself. So he got a nice little payoff. 100,000 acres of that was in Kerry. So William Petty, Anne Petty's father, was the richest man in Kerry.
So
after he did this.
Arabella was sort of the daughter of probably the richest couple in Kerry. Probably
for
one
sure.
of the richest couples in Ireland.
One of the richest couples in Great Britain, actually.
And she married someone.
She married Denny. No, I know the Dennys are the same family. They're like a rich Kerry family, and Denny sausages come from Denny's.
Yeah, he's not all that relevant because he dies pretty quickly. And then,
the fact that he dies is good, though. It's good for her.
It's useful for us as well.
Yeah,
it clears it all up, and then she's left with a lot of money.
Yes, yeah.
So I think from that perspective, this is interesting because it's an interesting story to have a sort of a rich, unburdened woman in that way. You know, she would have had control of her own money, which would have been somewhat unusual.
Yeah, and she refused to get married again because she wanted to keep that status. Mm-hmm. What did she do with her money is the question. And her power and her status.
Yeah.
Yeah. She set up the wonderful charitable organisation.
No. Oh, yes.
The Magdalene Laundries.
But I don't think they weren't the charities as we know them.
Yeah. Obviously, the Magdalene Laundries has been the scene of a lot of abuse and repression, and has not been a good force in Ireland, certainly in the 20th century, probably the 19th century. But I believe she set it up with the best of intentions, right?
They were set up as a home for women, destitute women, or as they're called, fallen women, to go into and sort of become unfallen, I guess. It was like a way for them to get back on their feet. I think it's interesting to hear about this because it sort of tells us a certain amount about how the upper class saw themselves in society and maybe their responsibilities to the working class or the poor.
Yeah, and for me, it's still strange, I have to admit, because she's still going to all these swanky parties. She's still minted. So, like, she's seen as this great person for charity, but she never leaves her wonderful life as an upper class person.
So it sounds like she was unusually from talking to Rosemary, she's unusually involved in the charity at a one-to-one level.
Okay, she spent a lot of time in there caring for,
I think
for people and stuff.
not a lot, but probably more than anyone else. I'm sure she wasn't slumming it with the rest of them, but
yeah. That is true. That is true. This wasn't just like she went to the parties and she fundraised, like Ivanka Trump. She was actually in there in the hospital, making sure it was run right and meeting the patients. I was going to say, but the residents. Yeah, so it's not so bad as I seem to.
Yeah, so you have someone who is obviously somewhat caring, but has no interest in examining the structure of society. She's not trying to bring about any revolution or something. She's just trying to make people's lives slightly more bearable. So I think that's an interesting place to jump into it.
Yeah.
Anne Petty herself was a very interesting woman because she'd grown up as William Petty's only daughter and probably his favourite child, and had been educated alongside her brothers. So she was highly intelligent and cultured. And then she marries Thomas Fitzmaurice, who was pretty tyrannical, I think.
Okay.
And they weren't a very well-matched pair. Their nephew actually says that he made an excessive bad husband. So I don't think it can have been a very happy household. He was also a tyrant, both in the countryside around, because of course he was a great figure in the country. And so he was known for his tyranny around around Kerry, but he was also a tyrant at home. So given to rages and eccentricities and strange ideas. So that was the kind of household that Arabella would have been born into.
Okay. We were talking to a guy, John Knightley, and we were trying to figure out. We knew Fitzmaurice was a tyrant at home, but was he was a tyrant in the general sense as well, was he?
Oh, he was. Yes. I think he was very much still a sort of feudal lord. There's one story, I can't remember where it comes from, that when he sat in court, that he'd have his riding whip with him. And rather than bother with sort of imposing fines or imprisonments, that he'd simply give his own punishment with his riding whip.
Really?
So he was very much his own ruler down there.
Okay, and that was that was a bit old-fashioned, was it? Wouldn't you say?
I think it probably was. Yes, I think it was, as I say, harking back almost to a kind of a feudal idea of a lord.
And so Arabella Denny, her grandfather was William Petty.
Her grandfather was William Petty, who, of course, would have been an entirely different type of person. He came from a humble background and had sort of scraped together an education, but was very brilliant. And eventually came to Ireland with the Cromwellian forces and mapped Ireland, hence the Down Survey. He was responsible for the Down Survey. And for his part in that, he was given lands throughout Ireland, and the major part of the lands, of course, were down in Kerry. So you're talking really about two great families in Kerry. One of them, the old established Fitzmaurice family in the north of the county largely, and then William Petty, the new English coming in with his great tranche of lands. And so the marriage really between Anne Petty and Thomas Fitzmaurice was, I suppose, a dynastic one to join together those two families.
Okay, and that's where Arabella was born into.
That was what she was born into. She had two surviving brothers anyway, and three sisters. And of course, the marriages of the daughters were kind of designed as well to increase the Fitzmaurice family's influence. So one of the daughters married a Crosby. Another married a Colthurst from, I think, Cork. And Arabella married Arthur Denny of Tralee Castle.
Okay. And so when you were talking about how she was cultured, and raised in a cultured way, what was seen as cultured for the time, if you know what I mean?
Well, she would have learned sort of the kind of accomplishments and the sort of learning that a well brought up young lady would have. So she would have learned languages. She would have had accomplishments like music and drawing. She actually was a very good singer, apparently. Even in old age, there's a description of her singing with a very sweet voice. And she would have learned how to run a large establishment, like the old court at LIXNAW. And of course, that was something that she would later be able to bring into her own married life, but also later on into her charitable enterprises, because after all, running a charitable establishment wasn't entirely different from, say, running a great household of the time.
Mm-hmm. And was that normal for the time to be basically to have a woman educated like that?
I think she was probably fortunate in having a mother who was already educated, and who would have. Her mother, for instance, was a friend of Swift. So she was very much part of the sort of cultured life of the time. So I think she was fortunate in that way. But girls of that class would at least have had an education in accomplishments of that sort.
Okay.
The idea really was that they should be able to be good wives and uphold their husband's position, and also sort of make a creditable figure in social circles.
Okay. And were they being seen as a partner to their husband? If Arabella was,
I think that would depend very much on the partnership. Certainly, Arabella's grandmother, Elizabeth Petty, who married William Petty, was very much his partner. And that was a remarkably close relationship. She was an Anglo-Irish lady. She'd previously been married and widowed, and she married William Petty. And there appears to have been a love match. But they very much worked together to maintain his various interests. And in fact, at one stage, he sent her to Kerry. It's a very interesting episode. He sends her to Kerry because he couldn't travel himself, and asks her to report on his enterprises there. So that is an example, really, where you see a couple working together. Then with Thomas Fitzmaurice and Anne Petty, the various observers remarked that she actually managed to sort of safeguard his fortune, educate the children, keep up the family's credit, if you like, where he was rather where he was really such an eccentric character, but that while she lived, the family were able to maintain its position. So it did very much depend on the partnership. Then when Arabella married Arthur Denny, again, it doesn't seem to have been a match made in heaven. Arabella was highly intelligent, cultured. She married this man who I think the account of him says that he was a very good sort of man, but uninformed and ignorant. So it doesn't sound as if they had a huge amount in common. She seems to have got on well with her mother-in-law, who was Letitia Denny. And she speaks of her with great affection later on. But they would have... There is one odd story about her early married life, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it. Apparently, Arthur Denny's brother, Thomas Denny, subjected her to some sort of harassment or persecution. We don't know what it was. Could have been sexual harassment of some kind. And it drove her to such a state that she apparently went and learned to fire a pistol. And then she lured him to a retired spot and showed him how she could fired the pistol and said that if he didn't leave her alone, that she would come behind him, was how she put it, because he'd made her careless of her own life. And essentially warned him off, and apparently he left her alone after that. So it's a really interesting story, I think. But it does, apart from anything else, it does show her sort of determination and her self-reliance at that stage.
I think that's interesting. I think when we think back in this time, we have a instinct to like simplify everything.
Mm-hmm.
So we come up with this idea that women were completely and utterly downtrodden, you know?
Yes, and so much depends on circumstances and on the personalities of those who were involved. I mean, that was a situation which could have ended up with her as a victim.
Yes,
but
of course.
She managed to turn the tables.
Yeah, and there's...
And of course, it may have helped as well that her family, that Thomas Fitzmaurice, whatever his faults, was a powerful figure in the locality, and that he was only a few miles out the road.
Yes.
Certainly that would have given her a standing. And I suppose the interaction as well between the various families could be very interesting, because you've got the Fitzmaurices, who are the old Anglo-Norman family, long established in the area. You have the Dennys, who came in sort of in the Elizabethan period. So again, they're quite nouveau, if you like. And then you have the very nouveau riche Pettys, who have only been there really a quarter of a century, well, half a century, really.
Half a century would have been seen as still nouveau riche, would it?
Very, very much nouveau riche, and they were very riche. So it's an interesting moment as well in Irish history, where you see those the various forces really.
Would the length of time have its own cachet? You know, that the family had been there. Like, was there a hierarchy based on how old the families were, essentially?
I suppose there was. I suppose there was a certain snobbery about new money then, as there would always be. But then, of course, you do get alliances. You get the various groups allying themselves by marriage, as I said, the Dennys and the Dennys and the Fitzmaurices and the Pettys. So they made their own accommodation, I suppose, with the new families who came in.
Actually, when we were talking to another guy called Joe Harrington, we were talking about the idea of marriage. And you used the term love match a few minutes ago. And was that to say that that couple married for love at maybe the cost, or at some financial cost, or giving up some material opportunity? Like, basically what I'm saying is, did they just marry for love, or was it a coincidence?
Oh, Lord, no. I think that was probably the exception. I think the Pettys' relationship is quite interesting. She, as I say, had been married before there, so they were both reasonably mature when they married. It was his first marriage. And her background wasn't very that desirable. Her father had been one of the regicides. He'd signed Charles I's death warrant. So he was essentially in disgrace from 1660 on. He unlike some of the other regicides, he wasn't executed, but he was imprisoned. So her family background wasn't particularly desirable. But I think definitely you can tell that there is a great attachment between them. But I think that I think was probably exceptional. I think in the case of families from that particular strata of society, reasons of alliance and money, of course, and land would come into it.
Okay. So what would Arabella's life have been like as a child in the area? Do you know?
It's impossible to tell. We have very
Yes.
little information on children's lives. We do know that she and her siblings did go to London sometimes and to Dublin with their mother. I think probably their mother spent more time with them than Thomas did. They would have been educated at home, but we really don't know very much about children's lives.
I suppose it's probably relatively recently that we've started actually thinking about what children's experience is like.
I think so, yeah. And it's so hard in any case to recapture that, because the accounts that you have, after all, are written by adults who are looking back to their own childhood. Now, her nephew, Arabella's nephew, William, who was more or less abandoned by his own family, did grow up at LIXNAW as well. And he, under the care of Thomas Fitzmaurice, his grandfather, and he paints a pretty miserable picture of his life there, living with his grandfather, and says that the only comfort that he got really was from his Aunt Arabella, with whom he formed a bond at that stage. One of the, speaking about children, actually, one of the things that I do wonder about in Arabella's case is she didn't have children. She and Arthur were married for about 15 years or so, and there were no children. And I do wonder if the lack of children was one of the things that later on drove her to concern for the foundlings. And also she tended in later life to essentially adopt younger relatives. There are two or three young women that she took a very close interest in, and one of them, Catherine Fitzmaurice, actually stayed with her for the rest of her life, and essentially became her carer in old age. And at some stage, she says to her sister, she talks about having Catherine Fitzmaurice with her, and she says, "So you see, I had no children of my own, but now I have." These are my children. So I think it must have been a grief to her that she didn't have children. And I suppose as well a disappointment at a time when people would have expected to be able to hand on their land to the next generation.
Yeah, I suppose it would have been seen as a political disadvantage as well, not to have an heir.
And possibly, although we don't know, possibly a failure on the woman's part. The tendency might have been, but I'm only speculating there. But it's obvious the lack that her childlessness was obviously something that was in her mind.
Okay, and so to move on, your field of interest would be charity in the around this time.
Yeah, that was how I first came on her. First of all, she started her charitable enterprises down in Kerry as a young woman. Either, I'm not sure whether it was before her marriage or immediately afterwards, but we hear about a dispensary that she had at LIXNAW. So that was probably when she was just a young woman, and she may have been taking it. She may have been emulating her own mother, who probably was doing exactly the same thing. So she had an apothecary shop, as they call it, where she used to dispense medicines to the poor of LIXNAW. And then when she moved to Dublin after her husband's death. Another telling thing, after her husband died, she apparently had various other offers of marriage. And again, her nephew, who's a good source of information on her, says she had too much, she turned them all down because she had too much sense ever to become a slave again. Okay. So that may say something too about the nature of her marriage.
Yeah, it tells a lot, doesn't it?
It does. Now, when her husband died, she did express, all the proper sorrow and so on. But you do wonder what the relationship was like. In any case, after he died, she moved to Dublin. And so she had a very long widowhood, really, from 1742 to, she had a 50-year widowhood, half century of widowhood. And she really devoted herself then to travel for the first couple of decades of that period, and entertaining. She became very much a figure in Dublin's social scene, and good works of various kinds, which is where her reputation really rests.
And so her mother was involved in charity, and so was it a normal thing?
I think her mother must have been. I think that must have been. She must have been carrying on what would have been very much the practice of the time, that you would sort of look after the poor in your own neighbourhood and on your own estate. So I think that was where a lot of women actually first became involved in sort of good works.
And what would you say the philosophy behind that level of charity was?
I think there was, as there always is, I think there was probably a mixture of motivations. There was sort of the Christian teaching, that you do good and you succor the poor, the needy, and so on. So there was that. I suppose there was a degree of self-interest, that you look after the disadvantaged, to in a sense, create a sense of obligation towards you. That it was in a way safeguarding the stability of society. And as far as the situation in Dublin is concerned, I think during the 18th century, you also have sort of urbanisation. So you have the growth of towns, and particularly of cities like Dublin. So you have the poor gravitating towards those areas, towards Dublin. So there's a greater incidence of poverty, but also the poor are more obvious. They're apparent. They're on the streets, creating both concerns for security and also a kind of an impulse to do something to relieve poverty.
One of the things we're thinking a lot about is, like, around this time there's a move to pasture farming, we believe. Which would have created a lot of unemployment because...
And those would have been the kind of people who turn up in Dublin looking for... And the other large or growing urban areas looking for employment.
That's interesting. We're sort of trying to figure out what was happening at the time with all the unemployment, And I suppose it makes sense.
And of course, when people move away from their own area, when people move to a city, they are lacking the sort of support structures that they might have had, family support structures, local community support structures. So they're kind of, in a way, cast into outer darkness, in a sense. That is one of the things that's happening, I think.
Were there any big towns in Kerry or in Munster, apart from Cork, obviously?
Cork
was the main one.
Yeah, Limerick, I suppose, would have been growing. Waterford.
Okay.
But the trend would certainly be towards the larger towns.
Yes. So Arabella's main charity work was
Well, she started up. It was a period, as I say, because of these various factors. It was a period where you've got various initiatives starting up. So first of all, she became involved, for instance, in the lying in hospital, now the Rotunda, Bartholomew Moss's lying in hospital. Where poor women went to have their babies. So that's one, that's a response to need at the time. She became involved in the Dublin Society, now the RDS, which was concerned with things like promoting Irish agriculture and trade and industry. So you have an interest in things like the linen industry, textile industry. and she, over the years, she was a patron through through her Dublin Society involvement to sort of Irish carpet makers and artists and that kind of thing. So, she actually was the first honorary member and the first woman member of the Dublin Society. So you can see there she's becoming very much a figure in Dublin high society at that point.
Would she have had an interest in the practices that were promoted? You know, say like linen or. I
think so, yes, because linen would have been flax would have been grown on some of the estates. So she would have been familiar with that. She had a great friendship, for instance, with Lady Caldwell up in Fermanagh, Balleek, you know, that area there. And they certainly had interests in the linen industry. And there was this idea of improvement. She very much fed into that idea of improving industries and things around the country.
Yeah.
As a way of increasing prosperity generally, and you know, helping people on the ground.
That's interesting, because we were talking to another guy, John Knightley. I mentioned him before, about improvement, and he was talking about the idea that they were intellectually interested in improvement. You know, that they're quite excited by the signs, but I suppose it makes sense that they saw it also as a way to improve people's lives on the ground. Yeah.
Well, I think she would have been very much part of that, and the Dublin Society, that would have been a kind of a central plank of the Dublin Society's work. So I think that's what's going on there. But then she then went on a trip to. She travelled abroad a bit. She went to London a couple of times, but she also made quite a more adventurous, if you like, grand tour in Europe. Okay. And you see her visiting there. She visits various charitable enterprises and things there. And then in the 1750s, she became involved in the Foundling Hospital. The Foundling Hospital was, it was a department, really, they called it, of the Dublin Workhouse. And it was a public institution. It had a huge board of governors, something like 175 governors, but none of them seemed to have paid a great deal of attention to the actual routine or conditions at the institution, which were appalling. Because it was publicly funded, you get regular reports to Parliament about conditions at the Foundling Hospital. And they were really dreadful. The mortality rate was extremely high. Foundlings were brought in not just from Dublin, but from all over the country. And they're taken to Dublin in really awful conditions. Sort of, there are references to donkeys with baskets on their back full of babies. Just dreadful.
Sorry, just a foundling. It's an abandoned child, is it?
An abandoned child, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this institution was here in Dublin, and there was obviously a pressing need for reform. So she reacted, probably in response to one of these parliamentary inquiries that uncovered conditions too horrible for the ear, as they say somewhere. Okay. And she first of all set up a committee of ladies, and the idea was that they would go in, and because we're getting back here to the skills that women were expected to have, because they would have the skills to run an institution, that they would go in and oversee reform. But in fact, most of the other ladies dropped out, and she was left to oversee the institution. And she was involved with it for about 20 years and brought about real change there. The mortality rate halved, I think, when she was there. She employed more nurses, introduced introduced greater supervision of the staff in the institution, and also a lot of there was practice of sending children out to board in other homes. Who would obviously get some money for looking after them. But initially, a lot of those children actually just disappeared.
Really?
So she introduced more oversight on that. And one of the sort of more tangible things is she apparently introduced a clock. She said that children, small babies, needed to be fed often. So she introduced a clock which chimed every 20 minutes. And when it chimed, that the children were all to be fed, so that they get regular nourishment.
So
so she was very hands-on.
So they sort of weren't being fed, basically, was one of the issues.
No. I mean, it was as I say, the conditions were just unbelievably dreadful, and there was neglect, but there was also active cruelty and brutality.
And what would have happened, say, if a child survived and left? What?
Well, the idea was that they would be taken in and that they would learn trades to enable them to get a livelihood. There were both boys and girls, and both of them would have been given sort of the training that was thought proper to their particular gender.
Okay.
But of course, a lot of them didn't ever survive to go out. But that was the idea, that they should be trained.
I suppose with all these things, there's an element of punishment as well. Or is it?
Well, in that case, I think the sort of general attitude to illegitimacy, the disapproval of illegitimacy, fed into both the fact that you have foundlings in the first place, and also later on, the fact that they were foundlings probably didn't make people particularly sympathetic towards them anyway, but also having been brought up in this really unsatisfactory and appalling institution, they wouldn't have been particularly desirable as employees anyway. So
yeah, it'd be hard to come out.
Very much, yeah, so they didn't have very much hope of a future. And in fact, I think that may be one of the things that directed her attention next towards prostitutes and fallen women, because first of all, a lot of the children who came in would have been the children of what they would describe as fallen women, but also a lot of the girls who went out probably ended up on the streets because they wouldn't have been able to find any other employment.
Just a note, these would have been Protestant. I know the Rotunda is a Protestant hospital, and did it matter to them who came in? Were the children raised as
No. The children would have been raised as Protestants.
Okay.
Insofar as they were raised, I don't know how effective it ever was, but that as well, that would have been another factor that would have turned a lot of Dubliners against, or would have meant that Dubliners had less sympathy for them, because it would have been regarded as a proselytizing institution.
I see.
But then, interestingly, later on, in Lady Arabella's own institution, the Magdalene Asylum, they took in both Protestants and Catholics, and it was a Protestant institution, but they don't seem to have gone in for proselytizing to any great extent.
Okay, and what year did she start the Magdalene Asylum?
She started the Magdalene Asylum in 1767, I think it was. It opened in Leeson Street. And she said afterwards that the care of it was kind of forced upon her, but I don't know whether that was true or not. She was certainly involved in it right from the very beginning. And as I say, we have the registers now. where you can actually see her entries right through every day with people coming in. Now, it wasn't ever a particularly big institution. I reckon there was no more than about 12 or 13 people, women living in it at a time. But it was the first such institution in Ireland. There had been similar ones on the continent, and that's why I think her visit to Europe might have had a part there, and also in London. But it was the first such home in Dublin, and the other significant thing I think about it was that it was from the beginning very much a female-run institution. When she was in the founding hospital, she, through strength of will really, she was able to bring about various reforms, but she always had to deal with the all-male Board of Governors and with Parliament who gave the money. But once she had her own private institution, she was in charge. And she actually set up a board of governesses, as they were called. They were various women, aristocratic and gentry women, who used to visit the home and take an interest in the girls and instruct them sometimes, and later on often give them jobs. And one of the things there that is happening is that you get women who actually weren't in there as governesses, but who later on set up their own charitable institutions. So it's kind of a knock-on effect that she's producing a body of women who are interested in charitable activity and who are getting training in the running of institutions like that.
So who are the women going in? Who would be the recipients? Like you say, fallen.
Well, they varied hugely. Most of them, I think you could say, were poverty-stricken. They came in. I should say that the registers are hugely informative because they give the name of the woman. They give they say what clothes or what possessions she came in with, so you get some idea of her background. They sometimes give more information about what work she'd done or what training she'd had, or in some cases, if she was literate, her literacy level. And sometimes other little details about her family or her background. So we do get some idea. Most of them do seem to have been driven in by sort of need or infirmity. So you get accounts of women coming in rags, wearing nothing that didn't have to be burned. So essentially, really at the very lowest point of their fortunes. And of course, that could have been what drove them into the Magdalene Asylum. They were supposed to have to be sort of entirely penitent and resolved to give up their way of life and to live, a godly and respectable life in the future. But there may also have been other factors, illness or dire poverty that drove them in. But then you do get a few instances of women who clearly came from another background. There was one, for instance, who spoke French. So that suggests that either she'd grown up in a reasonably prosperous household, or maybe she had travelled. You get others who come in with actually quite an array of goods, books, clothes. One of them had 12 gowns, which in those days would have been really quite an extensive wardrobe. One came in with silver teaspoons. And my favorite one, I think, came in with a red silk gown, a white riding habit, and a hat with a feather. And I always think if you went back to the 18th century, you couldn't look for a better sort of capsule wardrobe than that.
Yeah. And what was going on there? Was that was she being sent there, do you think, or was it just a genuine?
Or she could have had a reasonably prosperous past life. She might have been somebody's mistress and accumulated.
Oh, I see.
Stuff, yeah, or she may have come from a middle class background. Again, as I say, you sometimes get accounts of their background. So some of them would have come from sort of tradesmen's or merchants' families. There was one I remember whose father was a hatter in Dublin. So it was very varied, and of course. It was announced that it was for penitent prostitutes. Not all of them, I think, were probably prostitutes in the sense that they'd necessarily been on the streets. They may simply have been girls who had fallen foul of the moral code in some way.
Okay.
There was one, for instance, who actually was regarded as a sort of a special case. She'd married a man who turned out to be married already. So she was really entirely a victim of bigamy. So there was a while, and later on, the house, as it was called, the institution, was said to be designed for girls after a first fall. So that would have been, really girls who just sort of, in inverted commas, erred once. And
right.
So some of them, as I say, the stories behind them are obviously very varied.
But penitence would have been seen as...
well, they were. Penitence was essential. Of course, it's easy enough, I suppose, to claim penitence if you need to get in. I mean, you can sometimes you can flesh out the stories. There's one woman who came in, was there for a while, and then a soldier arrived, and she insisted on leaving to go with him. Now, there possibly what's happening is that she was living with this soldier, that he may have been sent elsewhere, and that in his absence she needed some sort of maintenance, so she goes into the asylum and then leaves again. So sometimes there are those kind of stories that, and I also wonder sometimes, for instance, things like bad weather or illness could drive women in there as well.
Bad weather.
Well, in the depths of winter, for instance,
I see,
if you haven't got anywhere to go, maybe you go to the Magdalene Asylum and claim refuge there.
So people would have been aware that there were charities. They would have been familiar with charities. The people on the receiving end.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. They would have been aware of the existence of this place as something that they could seek refuge.
It's much later on, but I know during the famine, these sort of charities were outlawed, or at least discouraged. Would that make sense to you? Or have I gotten that wrong?
No, I'm not quite sure what you're watching.
Maybe I just read something that wasn't true. I heard that the government discouraged, basically wanted the Irish people to become self-reliant, and it saw these charities as counter to that. Yeah,
I don't really know what you're referring to there, because certainly the 19th century was when charities really mushroomed. They were
interesting.
Charities for absolutely everything. So I'm not sure. It may have been an individual instance or something. I'm not sure what.
Sometimes with the famine, there were all these political rumours where people want to make England seem as cruel as possible, So it could have just been something like that.
Well, the 18th century anyway is sort of a different story. So
what would be the government's approach to these charities? Or do they have any? Were they just?
I think the government were probably quite happy to see that so long as it wasn't costing them anything. And later Arabella was fortunate, really, in having useful contacts. That was one of her great advantages. As I say, she was part of the Dublin social scene, so she actually used to attend dinners at the Lord Lieutenant's table in Dublin Castle. Her nephew, the nephew that she was so close to, briefly became Prime Minister in the UK. So she did have all these useful contacts. She had people that she could approach for assistance. And they used to come to the asylum and visit it, buy some of the goods made by the girls. And I should say that the regime within the charity, within the Magdalene Asylum, while penitence was the main requirement, that you should say that you repented your past life, and there was a sort of an element of punitive attitude within the place. The girls, for instance, were known by numbers, and
really?
Yeah, but that was partly, I think, a thing for confidentiality. They did record their own names as well, and they, in the chapel, because there was a chapel adjoining the chapel, there was a screen. The girls used to sit behind the screen so that they couldn't be seen. Again, not sure whether that's punitive or whether it was, again, to preserve their confidentiality. But what I do always like to stress is that it wasn't somewhere that you went into and you never came out of again.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea was that you went in, you received training, you repented of your past, but you also received training, and that was hugely important. And the idea was that the training should enable you to earn an honest livelihood in the future. So the average length of stay was only about 2 years. And then they went out, and the requirement was that they should either go out to earn an honest livelihood on their own account, or they should be received back by their family. So every effort was made to ensure that happened.
I see. And what sort of work?
So there was a kind of there was at least an element of constructiveness in the idea.
What sort of work would they have been trained in?
It was mainly sewing. Most of those who went in who claimed some kind of training said that they had sewing skills of some sort, plain sewing. There were other skills as well. There were actually a lot of them were in the clothing and textile trades, but you also had cooks, for instance, or domestic servants, or one woman actually claimed to be a sailor, to have served as a sailor for 5 years. Really fascinating little story, yeah. Again, we don't know anything more, but it's just such an intriguing little detail.
Yeah, I think that would have been unusual.
Yes, I think it probably would, but it's intriguing that it happened at all.
Yeah.
But yes, most of them, the kind of jobs that were available to women in any case were very restricted. Essentially, you were talking about the needle trades, either plain sewing or more skilled sewing, like mantua makers and so on. So it was either the needle trades or it was domestic service. So those were the kind of skills that they were trained in, and then they went out into those kind of jobs. And of course, the women who took an interest either as governesses or as subscribers, because again we have lists of subscribers, often came up with jobs with places, as they say, for these girls. So they went to work in their households.
Okay, so there would have been a trust, I suppose, built between them.
An element of it, yes, yeah, in the sense that these women were taking an interest in the progress of the girls and providing jobs for them. Yes, they were supporting the institution in that way, I suppose.
And maybe it's impossible to say, but would a lot of these women, we were talking earlier about unemployed labourers. Do you think they would have come in from the countryside, or are they mostly Dublin?
These women?
Yes.
Some of them did, yes. Some of them did. We do hear that some of them came from, they actually list parts of the country that they come from. But quite a few of them, they would say that they came from Dublin or so on. We don't always have those kind of details, but it does seem to have been. It seems to have been both of them. Yeah. For instance, you get sometimes girls, not that many actually, but a few girls claim dairy skills. So they were obviously, milkmaids or involved in making butter and that kind of thing.
I think that's interesting to us. We're thinking about this period as a time of change, So those ideas of the knock-on repercussions, women going to the cities and maybe ending up in the asylum or in these charities is.
Yeah, well, the trouble is, I think that a lot the needle trades and domestic service, they're both poorly paid. They're insecure, and of course, in the case of domestic service, particularly, once you're out of a job, you're also out of a home. So you're literally on the street. You're also open as well, of course, to exploitation, sexual exploitation as well.
That was a big threat for women at the time.
It was, of course it was, yeah. So actually, when you talk about prostitution, probably you're not talking in a lot of cases about somebody who is a prostitute throughout their life. You're talking about it as a resource in a sense, when women have no other income coming in.
And was it illegal? Was prostitution illegal at the time?
It was, in a sense. The idea was that they were a public nuisance, really.
Right.
So it was the tendency previously had been to sort of contain the problem. And it's really only in the 18th century that you get the idea, you get a sort of an acceptance of the fact that it's need and destitution that are driving women to that, and that you've got, while they're still very much regarded as sinners, but there's an acceptance of the fact that they should be provided with some other training so that they don't have to resort to that particular contingency. And there's even, interestingly, in some of the sermons, for instance, there's even an acceptance of the sort of double standard that, while women suffer the consequences of this, in inverted commas, sin, those who had exploited them escape scot-free. But the charity is aimed at, if you like, providing a sticking plaster rather than changing society. So they've got to, they're working with society as it is rather than trying to change it.
Yeah, it's a pragmatic approach, but it's not the most.
It is, yes, it is, yeah.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for doing this. It was it's hard to get a good view of women's history, generally, but particularly around this time.
Yes, so the earlier period is more difficult to retrieve, I think.
So it's great to hear, even like just from every level, like we were talking about Thomas Fitzmaurice, and all the accounts sort of focus on him, and it's good to get like the female perspective on the home, But even
I think in his case, I think Lady Kerry is such an interesting character.
Yes.
Probably would repay further investigation. And it's interesting as well that you've got that sort of matriarchal line almost of strong women coming through in at least 3 generations.
And even hearing about what destitution did to women as opposed to men, is always... I know, it's just been... I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's great.
Good. I'm glad. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for doing it.
Thanks.